Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Gift of Crisis Video Summit. My name is Bridget Jackson-Buckley, and I'm very excited to be with you today. The focus of the summit interviews is to talk about the possibilities inherent in our most difficult moments and how we can choose to reframe to see crisis as a gift. Joining me today is Dr. Susan Mecca, psychologist, author, speaker, and organizational consultant. Susan's life passion is motivating audiences and clients to navigate through and move beyond the obstacles in their lives to find the very best of themselves and their potential. In 2005, her teenage son, Nick, was diagnosed with cancer. Barely 6 months into her son's 2-year aggressive chemotherapy protocol, Susan's husband, Vito, was diagnosed with a rare neurological condition and was hospitalized for 9 months. Over the course of the next 3 years, she and her family battled the diseases, ultimately beating both, only to have cancer appear again, this time in her recovering husband for whom the disease proved fatal. These experiences, along with over 30 years of working both as a therapist and consultant with individuals, families, and organizations facing impossibly difficult times, led Susan to write The Gift of Crisis, Finding Your Best Self in the Worst of Times, published in 2017. In the Gift of Crisis Video Summit interview today, Susan will share practical strategies and some secret sauce for finding one's way through serious life crises. She will also speak to the current research on post-traumatic growth and some ways to increase the possibility of finding growth, even transformation from tough times. Welcome, Susan.
Thank you, Bridget. I'm so glad to be here with you guys. What a great topic.
I know. I'm so excited to have you. I'm so excited about the information coming through in this summit. I can just barely sit still. Okay, so we have a lot to cover, so let's just go ahead and dive right in. So can you walk us through, talk about a little bit the family health crisis you experienced with your husband and son?
I think you did a great synopsis on it. I think the things that I would add to that is that we were a family who really had nothing stronger than Benadryl and Tylenol in our medicine cabinets. And all of a sudden we were sitting there with chemotherapy drugs at the dining room table. So it's a huge shock for our family. It's not something we expected. It's not something we, had even anticipated the possibility of. And so seeing Nick through this at a very critical time in his life, he was 16 when he was diagnosed, was a real challenge for both of us. Vito had done an amazing job. He was the retired military, extremely organized, everything in its place. And so he did a huge job with that. And so when he became sick with Guillain-Barré, and it was a particularly virulent form of Guillain-Barré because it paralyzed him really from the neck down. And it did not respond to traditional methods of healing. There's two different kinds of ways they use to get people through Guillain-Barré, and they tried it multiple times with him and it didn't. So he went from ICU of 80 days to a long-term acute care facility of 4 months to rehab of 3 months, and really came home in a wheelchair progressing to a walker. And so, we were really trying to figure out what the new normal was at that point. Nick finally went off to school. He was ready to see the end of his parents, as you can imagine, during those launching years to have been that close to us. And to have Vito stricken again, just really about a month into Nick's freshman year, was a huge blow to everybody. In fact, I may have told you this, but Vito, of course, having gone through 9 months of hell, was really having trouble finding his own resilience and was sort of going down the path of, do I really want to fight this? And I got a message from Nick that said, Dad is doing chemotherapy, right? None of this live out my life in peace crap. And I think Nick's thought was, you know what? I did 2 years of chemotherapy. Dad can suck it up and go do it too. And so Vito, for his son, I think more than anything else, went into battle. But unfortunately, as you mentioned, that battle was ultimately not successful. So there I was, within the space of really 3 short years, I'd gone from being, sort of a pretty traditional career woman, husband, and then all of a sudden I'd gone through husband and son going through cancer at the same time. I became a widow. I was an empty nester. I was now a single mother, sole family breadwinner. And to top it all off, I was laid off. And so, I did what anybody does under those circumstances. You figure out how are you going to keep the family going and how are you going to create a new life. But it was not the easiest of times.
Wow. I mean, that is so much, Susan. I mean, so much. What stood out, what a term that you said or a phrase that you said that I hadn't thought about was trouble finding resilience.
Mm-hmm.
And so you initially spoke about Vito having trouble finding resilience. Did you have any trouble finding resilience throughout all of that?
I think off and on that I did. I think the things but what really caused me to write this book was I'm surrounded by psychologist friends, as you can imagine. And so, one of them said to me, probably a couple of months after Vito died, he said, "How did you do this? How did you take 3, pretty serious gut punches and keep going?" And I thought, you know what? I do know something other people don't know. I had the best of all possible circumstances and the worst of all possible times. We had enough life insurance, we had enough health insurance. I had amazing friends. I was surrounded by competent, caring professionals who were there in the blink of an eye. We had access to great medical resources. And so, I had a lot of advantages other people didn't have. And then I had my own training on top of that and my own natural optimism. And so although I certainly threw some pretty spectacular pity parties, complete with food and alcohol from time to time, I was able to maintain my resilience. And that's a lot of what the gift of crisis is about, is how do you find and navigate yourself through a crisis and retaining as much resilience as possibly as you can.
Because also, just listening to you speak when you're talking about resilience, I'm thinking finding a purpose, finding a reason to go on. And if you're having a hard time with that, then that makes it even more difficult to take the next step forward.
Yeah. And I think for me, it's pretty simple. I had a child, we'll do lots of things for our children. We will fight lots of battles for our children. And one of my organizing principles was that I would stay upbeat and positive for Nick, because he's always been a barometer for me. I can see, and I've been a barometer for him. I can see how I'm doing and how he's doing by his reactions. And so I knew that if I cratered, that would send him the messages that were not going to be helpful to him in his recovery. And so there was crying, but it was always in the shower at night after he's gone, or if he was asleep. I chose to say, I've got this. In fact, when his dad came down with Guillain-Barré, at the time he was still recovering from almost dying in the hospital. I said to him, "You do what you can, I'll take the rest," because it was important for me that he devote all of his resources to recovery.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Goodness. Okay. And so when a crisis or tragedy occurs, or something a health crisis along the lines of what you dealt with, we immediately go to a thought process about what is happening. We think we know what to think or to believe and how to interpret what is happening. So from a limited perspective, there's a tendency to label things that happen as either good or bad. Nothing could be worse than this. And we can't sometimes see beyond it's either good or bad. But on a higher level, you couldn't possibly know the reason for everything that's happening. You couldn't possibly know all the outcomes. And so that leads me to the statement that you hear, everything happens for a reason. So while in the midst of the health crisis, did you believe everything was happening for a reason? And if so, how did you initially arrive at that belief?
I would answer that from a slightly different perspective. I think that as humans, we will always go through crises, obstacles, and other difficult times. And to believe anything else is just to lie to ourselves. I mean, stuff happens. We are spiritual beings on a human journey, and by definition, we are here to experience challenges. I think it's inherent in that. But I believe we have a choice to find the growth potential, a positive outcome, or maybe what you would call a reason in everything that happens to us. So while I don't believe that the divine gave Nick and Vito cancer, I believe that any health, financial, personal, or career crisis contains the seeds of transformation, but it's up to us to decide if we're going to nurture those seeds or not. So, you asked, how did I get to
Yes.
that? Yeah. And how did I get to that? It was years of reading spiritual and metaphysical texts, but probably the writer who had the biggest impact on me was Viktor Frankl, who was a neurologist and psychiatrist who in the 1940s was taken from his thriving practice in Austria and thrown into a concentration camp where ultimately he lost everybody in his family but his sister, including his wife and his mom and his dad. And he was both slave labor as well as doctor to the other inmates. And he emerged from that horrific experience in which he lost almost everything to write a book. And we don't know this because the American title is Man's Search for Meaning, okay? But the actual title was, Nevertheless, Saying Yes to Life. A psychologist experiences the concentration camps. And I love that he came out and said, despite this, I'm going to say yes. And there's two quotes that stick with me and still do, and they stuck with me during that time. When we're no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves.
Yes.
And then
Yes.
the second one is, between stimulus and response, there is a space. And in that space is all of our power to choose our response. And in our response lies our growth and freedom. And so, we forget when something happens, like you talked about, we immediately go to labeling it good or bad. But there is a space, and we can elongate that space. We can say, I don't have to make up my mind about what this means. I can choose how I will respond. I don't have to, do something. Years ago, I worked in a day treatment school for many, many kids. And invariably, they'd get into a fight. And they would say, Miss, it was self-defense. I had to hit him. And I go, well, what did they say? Well, he called me stupid. It was self-defense. I had to hit him. And so my job in that role was to elongate the space to say, okay, you have a space between him calling you stupid and you doing something. How do we make that space bigger so that you can choose a difference? How do we elongate the space between stimulus and response so we can choose a response instead of just react?
Wow, I like that. You said so much. I really like that you don't have to make up your mind immediately about what's going on, because I know there can be a tendency, you just want to know why. Why is this happening to me? As if difficult experiences are not supposed to happen. And I completely agree with you that we are here to experience the contrast, and to learn from these experiences as best as we can in the way that we can, exactly where we are in the moment. But that's such a good point, Susan, to just release that need to know why, because you may not get a definitive answer in that time that you want. There might need to be a little time and a little space, as you said, to just be present with what's happening in front of you.
Worked with a guy, not through therapy, it was an event I was part of. Amazing guy, Cuban. He was just so much fun, such a big experience in life. And he had stage 4 colon cancer and was still living a joyous life during it. And he said, people always ask me, don't you ever ask yourself, why you? And he goes, why not me? What makes me so special that I get to avoid the tragedies and crises in life? And I always thought, what a great way to go about it. Not that you're going to say, it should happen to me, but not getting caught up in the why me, because ultimately, how does that change things? Unless you can literally make a change from figuring out why and how to do it differently, how is it helpful?
And do you think that question signifies a punitive response? Like, why is this happening to me? Like, am I being punished for something?
Yeah, usually it does. I think it can come from a couple ways. I think most often it's punitive. What did I do? I think we have a tendency to have a sort of in many countries to have a belief that if we do everything right, nothing bad will happen to us. We say the right prayers, we go to the right place, we go to the right school, we say that we eat the right food. It's this guarantee that nothing bad will happen to us. And I think that's what spurs the punitive why me. I think that there's sometimes people are asking the question, not why me, but maybe why now? Why this? And it's my boyfriend's favorite question. He's a social worker by training as well. And he'll say, why now? And I think when we ask why, sometimes if we can ask it from a place of curiosity of, is there something for me to learn from this? then I think that can move us into a better place. But if we're asking it from what did I do wrong and how am I being punished, I don't think that helps us be resilient. I don't think it helps us grow.
Yes, because in my mind, it signifies that you believe something is happening to you and not for you.
Exactly. And I think that we have to make sense of it in our own ways. And not everybody will.
Yes.
I've known
Mm-hmm.
people who are 20 years out from serious life crises who still feel victimized by that crisis. And I think that's a hard thing when you want to naturally see the gift in something, to recognize not everybody will. And in fact, it can be thoughtless of us to try to push that on someone too quickly, or to insist there's a gift when they can't see it.
Oh, I agree with you completely, because everyone is not always in the space to hear that, but you can hold a loving space for them.
Absolutely. And
You can totally do that. Mm-hmm. And the last point is, I really like that you said, hold a space of curiosity as well.
Mm-hmm.
That is so important.
I work on that a lot. I have a tendency to want to know the answer quickly, and so holding a space of curiosity. I'm preaching to myself on this one, Bridget. Preaching to myself.
I know. I used to be a seriously dedicated student of why is this, why, and I have definitely come to understand that that's not always the place to be. I mean, but you can ask why with what's here, what's underneath this, what's on the other side of this. I wonder what this will yield.
Yeah, what can I learn from this? What's open? It's like when you get a dream, I think we can, particularly if they're really relevant, they stay with us, they're not just a flotsam and jetsam dream. I'll wake up and go, so what's the meaning here? What can I learn from this? What signal is this giving me? And I always want to pay attention to those.
And it does not mean that you're seeing every day through rose-colored glasses. It doesn't mean that, you're sitting on a park bench with butterflies flying around. It doesn't mean that it won't feel difficult, but you just have a different way to frame it and to just be in the experience that might make it a little, not easier, but more manageable to walk through. Don't you think?
Well, I think it gives us, Viktor Frankl talked about it. So one thing we can control when we can't control anything else is how we will respond. Mm-hmm. So we can't control so much in our life, even though if you're like me, we spend a lot of time trying to figure out how to, but we can control our response. And so when we choose to say, and we'll talk about this, but when we choose to find ways to be grateful, we choose to find the strengths, we choose to find whatever, we are controlling something that actually is completely within our ability to control.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Very nice. Very nice. And saying goodbye to someone you love it can absolutely be one of the hardest things that you will ever do. I mean, we've all experienced loss. It's never easy to deal with, no matter how it comes. And sometimes in the midst of loss, anger can play a major role in grief, because sometimes it's easier to feel the anger than to feel the deep sadness. So with the loss of your spouse, you could have become angry. Could you talk about the mind-body connection and the psychosomatic response you could experience as a result of holding on to anger and resentment for such a long period of time, or even dealing with something as stressful as a tragedy or loss?
Yeah, I want to back up for just a second, because I know a lot of people can sort of see this differently. So we think as psychologists is complicated and uncomplicated grief. And uncomplicated grief is exactly its wide range of emotions. It's anger, it's resentment, it's stress, it's deep sadness, all of those things. And that's normal. And what we look for in that is really, is there some form of movement towards into integrating that experience into your life, finding a way to live with it, and going back to normal activities. And so, when people are completely raging about the death of a loved one, I don't find that at all a problem in the moment. The question is, does it go beyond sort of what is a reasonable period? And everybody has a different idea what that is. our criteria says you start looking at that after about 6 months. If no movement has been made, if people are still stuck in the anger and the resentment and the bitterness and all that, and that they haven't been able to move towards integrating it or moving on with their lives in some way. And by the way, integrating it doesn't mean you aren't just taken to your knees with
Mhm.
grief from time to time. I can drive by Children's Medical Center and tear up, and it's been 12 years since we walked through those doors, or I guess 11 years. So that's normal. What's not normal is when it becomes what I would call the organizing structure of your life. And that's when you see everything through that. It has become, everything is bad because this happened. No one can be trusted because this happened. Bad things will always happen because this happened. And I know people like that they've had a bad thing happen. And so their assumption is, anytime something's going well, bad things are going to happen. So it becomes that organizing structure. And you're focusing only on that. You can't remember the good times from your loved ones. Everything is sort of clouded over with this anger, resentment, and stress. And that does lead to, higher risk of physical illness. People can get heart disease, cancer, or high blood pressure because of the level of stress and adrenaline that's going on in their body. Anger's short, long-term, we all get angry, but long-term anger is just not good for the body. And so when you hang on to that anger and resentment, it takes its toll. And I will tell you, the older I get, the bigger the toll it takes. I joke, and it's not that much of a joke. I sort of given up being angry after I hit 50 because I didn't have the energy for it. It just took too much out of me.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So, and it can also lead to, like, hanging on to that can lead to anxiety. It can be part of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. You can have trouble with sleeping, depression, suicidality, behavior issues. It can lead to high alcohol and drug use. And so hanging on to that as being, like I said, your organizing structure has a lot of negative outcomes. I would also say, though, we have to remember to let people be angry. And I think one of the things that I've heard people say that have been the most damaging to them is when somebody is angry or deeply grieving and somebody comes and says, oh, well, it's God's will. They're in a better place. God needed them more than you did. Most people don't respond real well to that. And so letting people have their emotions, even though they're uncomfortable for us to witness. And that's the thing we have to remember, that when somebody's deeply into early grief, it's going to be uncomfortable for us. And the most
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I don't know that I would want to hear that. Of course, I know that God is in and around all things, all situations. But if I'm dealing with the loss of a child or a spouse in that moment, I can't imagine that I'd want to hear something along those lines. And I guess what I was thinking about with the psychosomatic responses is that there is there's lots of validated research on the mind-body connection. You just can't get away from that. And it seems that so many people could experience undiagnosed symptoms and illnesses that could have a root in these emotional issues, like really hanging on to these intense emotions, because our healthcare system, the Western medicine, seems to address primarily the symptoms. If you're walking around for years just really angry, or you could forgive someone, of course, it seems like that's going to show up in your body.
I think it will. I think it's not as much of a straight line as we want to believe it is. I think absolutely there's mind-body connection. I know that, I can see it in myself. And if I'm hanging on to anger, all kinds of things that are not necessarily positive in my body can happen. And so I think it is really critical to look at the emotional correlates of a physical experience someone's having. I think where we can go astray is assuming, and I hear people like, oh, well, lung cancer is just resentment held on to too long. Well, sometimes maybe. It also could be that they have a gene for cancer. It could be that they grew up around, smoking parents, or that they smoked like a fiend themselves. There's so many different aspects. I think we've had a little bit of, sometimes it's gotten a little bit too quick to say, and people hear it, as you say, not you, but one saying, well, you caused this. You caused this illness by being angry or resentful or whatever. I think we have to recognize that hanging on to resentment and anger and stress is just never going to help your body. It's just not going to work, you know?
Right. I mean, you hear it, but yet and still, people are stressed and people worry.
Yeah.
You know?
And that anxiety, I see it in people who are big worriers. I see them, I've seen them 30 years ago. I see them now, and you can see the impact of that worry on their face, much less what's going on in their body.
And so, you wonder, you just wonder, it doesn't ever occur to ask a question of yourself, is this serving me? Is this worry helping me?
And I think doing worry, in fact, is one of those things that can become superstitious. People believe that, if I worry about this, it won't happen. And they can tell you, oh, I really worried about my daughter getting into school, and she got into school. So somehow me worrying about it made the difference. And
that's interesting.
Yeah, it can become a superstition for some people. If I don't worry about it, then I'm not paying enough attention and bad things can happen. And of course, that's not true. You and I both know bad things can happen out of the blue. But people can, in our desire to have a reason or a way to control the life around us, worry is one of the structures people use to say, if I just worry enough, I can keep it from happening.
That's an interesting way you put that. I could totally see that. I can see that. So as a therapist, what have you found is the most accessible way in for people to hold the viewpoint of crisis as a possible gift in their lives, or at least something to learn from? How do you even get in there?
Yeah, very, very slowly would be step one. It's like Nick was probably, I don't know, a year plus into cancer before I said to him, and this is my child, so I get, lots of latitude, but I said, well, do you think there's a gift in this? Or is this just something horrible, nasty that happened to you that you just assume if it's a gift, you'd like to give it back? And he was able to say, no, there are some gifts, and here's what it is. And I think where we, again, where we go wrong, like with trying prematurely to stop grief, is we prematurely will go into people and say, well, I don't know, I can see a real gift in this, that you're going through this time and it's going to make you stronger. And, it's a pretty good way to get yourself kicked out of a friendship, I think, if you get a little bit too Pollyanna-ish. And so I think it's recognizing timing is critical. Somebody's spiritual makeup or beliefs is really critical in this. And recognizing, like I talked about earlier, go in with the curiosity, not the assumption that they're going to be able to see it the way that you and I might see it. But what I do ask is, sometimes I'll ask, hey, in addition to this horrible stress and the sleepless nights and the crappy eating and all those things that come with trauma, has there been anything that surprised you in a positive way? Anything unexpected that you really didn't see coming? And I'll say, for example, were there people who showed up that you didn't think would show up and they were there? Did you find something within yourself that you didn't know was there or never knew you were, that strong? And when you start to ask questions from a place of curiosity, then they can go, well, yeah, I really do find myself feeling a lot more compassionate towards other people who are going through crisis because I know what it feels like. And so then when you start that conversation, you can say, well, it sounds like despite all this incredibly crappy stuff you dealt with, there's been at least a small little upside to it for you, or something that's been positive that's come out of it. And then they can start, once they can see that, if they see that, they can start looking for other opportunities. But I think this idea of talking about it as a gift, it's rare. It's a rare person, and I think we're out there that can look at it going in saying, I think there's going to be something good that comes out of this. There's got to be a pony in here somewhere to go along with that old joke about the kid who gets a room full of manure, goes in looking for the pony. But I think you also have to, it's more likely that people can see that when they're further through the crisis than certainly the initial stages. The initial stages, you're just trying to keep all your bodily fluids inside your body at the same time. It's just scary.
Yes, you are. And I really, really like that question. Has there been anything unexpected? I really like that. I mean, because that's a completely different aspect to bring into this scenario? Like that's not something you often hear people ask, but it completely would divert your thinking. I like that. And I absolutely can see that. And it doesn't even have to be termed gift in the crisis, but that's just the term that we're using today. But that there can be several, and I definitely can relate to being more compassionate to people who are suffering or going through challenging situations, because I have done it, and I have experienced that. So I definitely can see the timing is important, recognizing spiritual beliefs, like the perspective that someone already has. And sometimes it's not that you have to show up and fix it or change it or frame it for them. Sometimes just sitting in the room with them as a loving presence is so helpful.
And I think you can also, and we'll talk about this in terms of post-traumatic growth, but I think you can also, you can notice it. You can say, you know, I saw you speak up for yourself in ways I've never seen you do that. I was awestruck by your ability to do that. And so we as friends can reflect those things back honestly. I mean, we don't want to make stuff up, but if we see something really cool, we want to say, that was pretty dang cool that you did that. And so people then can start going, oh, you know, I did sort of speak up for myself. I told that doctor what I thought, or I talked back to that person. I did do that. And they start to see themselves a little bit differently.
Very nice, very nice. Self-advocacy, or for your familial advocacy. Very nice. So for some people, it's very difficult to feel gratitude. It may feel inaccessible, too esoteric, too Pollyanna-ish, as you might say, to feel love, feel gratitude, or even to entertain the thought of being grateful during a challenging time. So let's talk about what role gratitude can play during a time of crisis, and what does the research indicate about the benefits of being in a state of gratitude?
Yeah, there's so much research from it. I think for me, you know, you're right. I know that when I would talk about being grateful, I'd feel like, and I loved Pollyanna. You know, I thought Haley Mills was it, and that was one of my favorite movies. So I probably just related a little bit too much. But it was the secret sauce. I mean, it was the thing. And I have to tell you, being grateful I didn't wake up in the morning going, oh, the birds are singing. You know, it was more like, you know, it was like digging deep. You know, it was like I'm driving home and going, I'm grateful it's not 100 degrees today. You know, I'm grateful the car's going. I mean, there were days it was scraping the bottom of the barrel. But by doing that and making that a habit, and I did it on my way home from the gym, then it opened my lens for it. And I was able to see things more quickly. You know, it's like once I started the process of thinking about how am I grateful, what am I grateful for, even when it was small little things, I was quicker to spot the other things. And when you start to look for the things that you're grateful for, it buoys your day. I mean, and research says that. I mean, it's that it has a positive impact on the psychological, the social, the physical well-being. Like, for example, physically, grateful people literally feel fewer aches and pains than people who are not. Okay.
Wow.
I know as I get a little bit older, I'm trying to keep track of that one. It creates a stronger social support. Imagine, of course it would. People who are grateful, we want to be around. And in fact, when you're creating a community of support, showing gratitude is a critical thing to keep that community of support going, because, you know, they're with you through thick and thin, but knowing you appreciate it is a big deal. Psychologically, there is an inverse correlation. In other words, the more grateful you are, the less likely you are to experience some post-traumatic stress disorder, which is when the trauma becomes super disruptive in somebody's life. People who are more grateful have less depression, they have more empathy, and they have less stress in their lives. And so, you know, it also helps people, believe it or not, overcome trauma. And so this is what you and I are talking about, is that when you look for reasons to become grateful, it literally helps you move through the crisis or the trauma even more effectively. And interestingly enough, in breast cancer patients, which is where they've done a lot of research, gratitude is associated with post-traumatic growth, reduced distress, and increased positive emotion. So there's a lot of, like you said, a lot of research out there. Robert Emmons, E-A-M-O-N-S, I think it's Center for Gratitude is a great source. they've done a lot of work with that. But yeah, gratitude is a secret sauce. I think the more you can scrape up a couple of things a day to be grateful for, it does give some resilience. It builds resilience.
And it literally feels like it is the complete opposite of what we were talking about earlier.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that, well, I have to worry because as I worry, I'm trying to implement some sense of manipulated control or to manipulate the outcome. But I find when, even now, like if we're dealing with something that I'm uncertain about, I'm concerned about, that I can quickly go to, it almost feels like a default, like as to before it did not. But I can go to, gosh, I'm just so grateful that I am supported by so many loving people. I have so many people that love me. I mean, and now that is something that you can see, it's accessible. It doesn't have to be, well, I'm just so grateful that the sky is blue. But, that I'm grateful my best friend is here with me.
Exactly. And, if all you can come up with is the sky is blue, then go for it, start wherever you can. But you're right, when you've got, when you can stop and really count those blessings, and the reasons to be grateful, it has a huge impact on everything. Your blood pressure goes down, everything gets better in your body when you're in a place of gratitude. So
I've noticed that my body, like I feel like I drop really into my heart.
Yeah, I agree. Absolutely. And that's actually can be a great thing to do, is to literally put your hand on your heart and think about the things that you're grateful for. It's a great way to sort of nurture your heart.
That reminds me of a few years ago, I went to an event to hear, he was one of the speakers, Tony Robbins. And one thing that he suggested that we do, he had us all stand up and literally put our hands on our heart and say, thank you to my heart for beating every day, for feeling love, for guiding me. And I was like, oh my gosh, I love that. I never even thought about that. So there are several ways that you can reach gratitude.
Absolutely.
So many ways. So let's talk about post-traumatic growth. So what is the current research on post-traumatic growth and some ways to experience transformation during tough times, and what exactly is it?
Yeah, it's literally what you would think. It is people who experience some form of growth in one of 5 different categories or more after a trauma or a crisis. And so they found a lot of the research has been done on people going through cancer, but they've done it on people who've gone through bombings and other, serious sort of world crises. And there's a lot of information on it right now, but the 5 categories are a greater appreciation of self. So I think for me, one of the things that I experienced was I sort of always knew I was strong, but after those 3 years, I just could no longer lie to myself. I was a strong woman. You didn't get sort of strong. Sort of like, okay, I can't go hide in the corner on this one anymore.
I am strong, yeah.
Yeah, I am strong. The second one is, like you talked about, enhanced personal relationships. Saying you may have always appreciated your support system, but all of a sudden you just realize the tremendous gold in them. And you just really realize how lucky you are. I actually had a friend who said the closest, most intimate times of her life with her husband was when he had cancer, because that's when they really sort of got down to the realness of each other. And she said it was an incredibly sweet time that allowed her, to feel like they really had a marriage of the hearts during that time. There's also a greater appreciation of life, a greater sense of compassion or empathy. I talked to a guy, a millionaire, and he told me he'd lost a child to suicide. And he said that he went to a synagogue after that. And he said, I'm not good at counseling people on anything, but if you ever want me to be there for somebody else who's lost a child to suicide, I will do that. And so this is a guy who never reached out to do that, but that felt to him critical to offer that, because he had he'd gone through this hard time and he wanted to be there for other people. But you also hear people come out and all of a sudden everything's brighter, and people who come to a near miss in a plane wreck, all of a sudden they have this like, oh my gosh, the sky's so blue. There's a sense of life is beautiful. The fourth one is a different perspective, an enhanced perspective on life and purpose. Many of us know people who've come out of a serious life crisis and gone in a different direction. They've quit a job, they've walked away from a marriage, they found a passion, they've written books, like some people we know. And so it can change that. That's one of the areas of growth. And the last one is in spiritual life. And this is not to say all trauma will enhance spiritual life. In fact, some people walk away from a spiritual life into trauma because they feel like they've been abandoned. But other people find, and I know I did, sort of an enhanced, a sharpened lens for grace, as one of my clients said it.
Yes.
I know I wrote it down when she said it. It's like, oh my gosh, that's great. I'm going to use that. And to really sort of be on the lookout for grace and for signs from the universe that I'm beloved. I mean, I think that is one of the things that has stuck with me as one of the forms of post-traumatic growth for me. And on a funny note, I'll tell you what it's done for my son and I is that nowadays and he's had a few bumps in the last few years. And so our joke is, if it's not cancer and nobody's dying, it's just not that big of a deal. And I think that's all part of that perspective on life is that, yeah, you had a car wreck, but you don't have cancer and you're not dead. So we can get through this, you know? So I've told him that saved his derriere on more than one occasion since that I've gotten this in this different perspective on life. He, by the way, uses it. He's in a residential treatment center as a manager and a counselor, and he uses it to help kids get a perspective. So when they talk about, my parents are being horrible to me because they've taken away my phone, I have a horrible life, he'll go, let's talk losing your hair 7 times. Okay. Now let's talk about that. So it's allowed him to really, he's got a perspective on life, and it's allowed him to help pass that perspective on.
It definitely gives you perspective. Yeah. It really, really does. Okay, wonderful.
How do you increase the possibility? Increase the possibility of it. We talked a little bit about that. Is that for us as people to watch it and to comment it when we see people doing that, to help others see that. And the other one is to help them figure out how is their story, or for us to figure out how do we create within ourselves a story that allows us to make room for crisis. So it's not the end of our life. Maybe it's a plot twist in our life. Okay, so I had this life, I had this huge plot twist. Now my life goes in this direction. But instead of seeing it as this point that like separates before and after, it's really just, I think of it as a plot twist, Things have shifted.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Okay, like a plot twist on the hero's journey.
Exactly. It's part of the hero's journey. It's part of our life, and this is the way it's impacted us. And so I think that's some of the research suggests that some of the ways that we can help people, ourselves as well as others, is to notice how we change, take the time to ask ourselves that, and then to think about our life in a larger perspective of how do we integrate this thing into our larger perspective of our life.
And it really ties into service because you're sharing from your experience. Yeah. You're sharing with other people, not necessarily to say, I have found the way, I now know, but this is what I found helpful. This is what I experienced. And I really like that. Oh, I forgot how she said it, but it so resenated with me.
Sharpen your lens for grace.
Yes.
Wow, isn't that amazing? I just love that.
I need to write that down.
This is a woman who's gone through serious, multiple, in some ways I called her the mini-me because it was like crisis after crisis after crisis. And it was like pretty crazy.
But I love it so much because I have definitely experienced and witnessed grace. I didn't put it that way, but once you recognize grace in your life, it is absolutely undeniable that there is a higher presence, that we're not doing this alone. We have help.
Exactly.
Yeah. Wonderful. Good stuff. I really like that post-traumatic. That's really enhanced sense of self, enhanced life purpose, possible spiritual life, sharpen your lens for grace. Well, she said that.
Yeah.
And sharing possibly what you've learned. That's wonderful. So how would you say that you allowed crisis to deepen your understanding of yourself to become a better person instead of a bitter person?
Well, I've already sort of owned up to being sort of a Pollyanna to begin with. So while I can hold a grudge longer than I'd like to, and like I said, can throw a pretty
Ooh.
darn good, well-catered pity party on occasion, I'm by nature optimistic, and I'm pretty open to experiences, which, by the way, are some of the factors that make post-traumatic growth more possible, is people who are open to new experiences. So I don't think it was ever in the cards for me to become bitter. But what I did do is I went into it. I wrote a letter to my clients when we found out, and I said, literally, I said, I believe, although this is hard, I believe that Nick Vito and I will grow in some amazing ways, some of them good, and are most of them good. So I went in assuming that there was good to be found in this, that I was going to go in there with my shovel, and by gosh and by golly, I was going to find it. I also reached out. I think what helped me become a better person, or to not be bitter, is I had an amazing support group, like we talked about. I was able to look at and utilize my own strengths to recognize when something scared me. I remember thinking, oh, I'm going to have to talk to all these doctors. I went, Susan, you deal with CEOs all the time. Doctors are no different. So it's like, okay, I know how to do that. So realizing how I could use the strengths that I had in the new setting. I also leaning on my spiritual beliefs, staying open to grace, and then staying grateful. And I think those were the 5 things that helped me not go in the bitter route, but instead to stay in the how do I grow and how do I change from this.
So let me be clear. There was one thing that you said: people who are open to new experiences are possibly more prone to post-traumatic growth.
Yeah.
That's important.
It is. And it's also, by the way, extroversion is another one. And I would say that whole openness, that interestingly enough, another thing is people who actually do a lot of writing and rumination on the experience and the time, processing it, digesting it, that can help them in post-traumatic growth. But the openness to new experience, think about it. If you're so closed that you say, this is exactly how my life is supposed to be, and this is thrown a spanner in it, I don't know how to come back from it, that is going to make it much harder to grow than somebody who says, you know, different things happen in a life and I'm open to them. Even though I didn't expect it to be bad, this is another new experience. They have a tendency to have better chances, not always, but chances for growth.
I mean, I could see that. I thought it was important to point out, because it just, the rigidity. I mean, what can come in?
Yeah.
If you are clinging so tightly onto what you think you know, to your viewpoint, what can come in?
Yeah. And it doesn't mean the minute it happens, everybody goes, oh, great, here's a new experience. You know, I have,
right, of course.
or I have, I've got this, I just got laid off. I mean, most of us aren't quite that evolved, but to say, okay, this is a new experience. It's not something I expected, but I've got some great skills. I've got some great friends. How do I go about and do this? And sort of, what will I learn from this? I don't want to be here, but I know I can learn something.
And yes, and of course, neither you or I are trying to make it seem like crisis hits and then all of a sudden everything is just,
you don't throw a party when crisis shows up.
Yeah, but you can, it almost feels sometimes like following spiritual breadcrumbs, like you're paying attention, you're connecting the dots, you're looking at all of these things happening, the people that are surrounding you, you're trying to be a little softer, recognizing that you don't have it all figured out, and nor do you have to have everything figured out.
No, exactly. I agree that staying open to say, one of my mantras was process, timing, outcome. I hand this over, and sometimes it sounded like this: process, timing, outcome. I hand this over.
Okay. So what has been the most surprising or unexpected part of finding a gift in crisis for you?
There's been so many, but I'm actually sharing one of them with my free gift. And so I'll talk a little bit about, put those two things together. It's that I realized I actually had a structure that would help not only other people, but actually help me when I face new crises. And I call it 6 steps to navigating a crisis, because when I looked across everything that I'd written and what I talked about and what I'd done, I realized there were sort of 6 steps and then some secret sauce, which of course is gratitude and staying open to grace and looking for gifts. But the 6 steps were, when a crisis happens, get centered. take a moment to pull in, because we get so ungrounded by crises. We're just everywhere. Our mind's going everywhere. Our body's out of control. We've done everything that we're evolved to do. Our body's digestion slowed down and respiration sped up, and all these terrible things happen. So taking a moment to just pull it in and get centered is step one in a crisis. Step two is get the resources. What resources do you need? What information, what people, what experts, what data, what are all the resources that you need? The third one is get intentional. Who do you want to be in this crisis? Because that is, you have no control over anything but that. And so if I can say, and I said in my second letter to everybody, I want to stay positive, grounded, and I think it was something else, and I can't remember now. But it's like, and I am asking for your help in getting me there. I'm asking for you guys to reflect that back to me, help me stay on track, because this is my intention, is to do this. The fourth one is get strategic. That means not only know your strengths and how do you use them, know your weaknesses and what you're not good at. My husband was the guy who took care of all the bills, even though I knew how to do it. I mean, I have an MBA and how to do it. I didn't like to. And so when he was in the hospital and I had to take it over, I literally bribed myself into paying the bills. I would pour a glass of my favorite Chardonnay at the time. I put on Diana Krall, and that was my bribe to sit down and do it, because I knew paying bills on a regular basis was a weakness for me. And so knowing both my strengths and my ability to be flexible and to understand hard stuff and deal with high-level people, but I also knew my weaknesses, and I got the help around my weaknesses to support me. The fifth one is get intuitive. I think it's really easy in a crisis to turn over what you're doing to experts and not to listen to your own wisdom. I pulled in a psychologist to help Vito sort of handle his own issues. And I realized 2 times into that, he saw him as an elderly man who would never recover, and he was talking to the medical staff the same way. And that was not helpful, and I fired him. I think he was good, but he was not what my husband needed. And so I trusted my own intuition about what my husband needed. And then the last one is get self-care. You've got to take care of yourself. If you don't take care of yourself, if you don't put on your own oxygen mask, you're not going to think clearly. You're not going to be present to the other loved ones. You're not going to make good decisions. And so the most, really taking time for self-care. And if you'll notice, centered, resources, intentional, strategic, intuitive, and self-care spell the word crisis. And so it's just a way to think about a crisis. And once I came up with that, I use it myself. When I hit a bobble, I'll go, okay, this is a checklist. Am I getting centered? No. Go turn on some music, meditate for a few minutes, get centered. Okay, now, what resources do I need? Who do I want to be? What can I use that I know? What does my gut tell me? That's part of getting centered. And what do I need to do to take care of myself right now? What do I need to say no to? What do I need to say yes to?
Those are really practical.
And that's what I wanted to leave people with, is these are some practical experience things you can do to help yourself and to help a loved one. If you see a loved one going through a crisis, you can say, let's take a minute. Slow, deep breaths. Put your hand on your stomach. Breathe into your hand. You can help people get grounded. Jump up and down, whatever those things are. Use these to help yourself and to help others when they are in the middle of a crisis.
I know I just said it, but I'm going to say it again. Those are really practical. Because when you're walking through the day-to-day, like what does that look like on a day-to-day basis when you are dealing with something serious? I mean, sometimes you're walking around your living room like, I don't even know what to do. Like you go to sleep at night, you're having dreams that aliens are landing on your front lawn. I mean, there's all this stuff going on. So you do want, like, what can I do? I need to feel grounded. I need to feel centered. And that may be walking outside, literally having your bare feet on the ground. It may be walking through your neighborhood. It may be sitting on the sand at the beach by yourself in the middle of the afternoon, or with your significant other or child, just watching the calming water. And I really like the one, get intuitive. You have to trust yourself, because even during these difficult times, there's guidance, there's internal guidance that's reaching out to you, that's connecting. It's there. It comes in so many forms, and you have to pay attention to those opportunities to just connect with it, and go with it as best as you can.
And to be encouraged by it. Mine was feathers in my path. That's sort of a Native American thing, if you see a feather in your path. And I have to tell you, I would be the middle of a mall, that there was no freaking reason there could have been a feather in my path. And I'd look down and there was a feather right there, and so those buoyed me up in the worst days, was to walk someplace and look down and there were feathers. It's like the universe was saying, hey girl, we're with you. I know it feels crappy right now, but we got your back.
Oh my gosh, I experienced that too. That is so funny, Susan. I experienced that too. Like, I would find feathers and there was no reason for there to be a feather there. And two things that were so funny about it. One, at the time I interviewed this author and she was telling about, she had a feather on the cover of her book, and I was like, I really like that cover. And she was like, yeah, it's all about surrender. And I was like, oh, I probably need to. Duh. But that's why I was finding so many feathers. Like, at the time, our oldest son was young, and he was like, Mom, don't you know it's illegal to like bring home loose feathers? Like, there's some law against. I was like, what? So I have a container filled with feathers, like some so beautiful, like that I wouldn't even know what bird it came from, but I have kept them all. And I, like you, look at it as a sign from spirit. Like, I'm not alone. There's guidance, surrender, relax.
Absolutely. Totally believe that. And those were the things that got me through the hard times, was
Those little things.
at least some of the things that got me through the hard times.
Yeah. Well, wow. I have really enjoyed talking with you, Dr. Susan Mecca, author of The Gift of Crisis, Finding Your Best Self in the Worst of Times. Thank you.
It has been my delight, Bridget, to talk to you. It's been lots of fun, and I feel like I found a sister of spirit.
Yes, absolutely. Like-minded, like-hearted. Thank you so much. And the link to the strategies, 6 practical strategies, and the secret sauce of gratitude will be included in your email with the video.
Yeah.
Thank
cool.
you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Oh.